The Carters had always liked the idea of getting a dog, but somehow life never fell into place. Finally, between work, school, and everyday obligations, there was never a good time. But that changed one autumn day when Sarah Carter, the mother of the household, came across a social media post about a rescue shelter seeking families to take in abandoned dogs. Then she saw an adorable picture of a golden retriever with soulful brown eyes, and something clicked. She gathered her husband Mark and their two kids, Ethan and Lily, into the living room. "How about we get a dog after all?" she said, excitement in her voice. The kids broke out into joyous fits, and even Mark, who had always been on the fence, found himself bopping his head along. The family drove to the rescue center the next day. Dogs barked and wagged their tails along the rows of kennels, each hopeful of being picked. But there was one dog, quiet, sitting in the corner of his enclosure, watching them with an almost knowing look on his face. His name was Toby. At the shelter, a worker told me Toby had been found roaming around an abandoned house. He was in good health, but somewhat taciturn. "He's a good boy," the worker told them. "Just needs a loving home." Lily knelt down by the cage. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. Now, for the first time, Toby stood up and wagged his tail, as if he had been waiting for nothing more than them. That was all it took. An hour later, the adoption papers had been signed and Toby was headed to his new home. On the ride home, the kids gushed about all the adventures they would have with him. But Toby sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window, more than just his eyes betraying something not exactly trivial, something that's hard to put words to. We learned something that is yet to be discovered. The first several days with Toby were nothing less than magical. He soon became part of the Carters' daily life. Mark would take him on morning walks around the neighborhood. Ethan and Lily would bicker over who got to feed him. Toby appeared to be doing fine and adapting to the warmth, attention, and love of his new family. His coat shone in the sunlight, and his tail never ceased wagging, a mute testament to the security he now knew. But as the days rolled on, small peculiarities began to emerge. It began with how Toby would sit in the living room and stare at the wall. At first, the family didn't think anything of it, assuming he was daydreaming or deep in thought. But as the behavior persisted, it began to feel a little weird. Why is staring at the wall like that? One evening, Ethan asked, looking at his parents. The dog had sat in the same place for more than an hour, the eyes not blinking. "I'm sure it's nothing," Mark said, although a little edge crept into his voice, a small unease he could not quite shake. Even Sarah, the always calm one, felt a flicker of unease. Toby would also become still and quiet when anyone tried to go into the basement. The door creaked open, and Toby froze, ears pricked, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. The family initially dismissed it, attributing it to the dog's past trauma. After all, rescue animals were often quirky due to their prior experiences. But one afternoon, while Sarah was sorting groceries in the kitchen, she heard Toby's nails clicking on the hardwood floor behind her. With a start, she twisted around in her desk chair, only to see the dog standing still, staring at the basement door, his eyes locked on hers. "All right, what's wrong with you, Toby?" she said, stooping to give him a scratch. Toby's tail wagged once before he turned away suddenly and went back into the living room. It was so subtle, too subtle to fully understand, but it felt like something was wrong, something Toby wasn't ready to give up yet. In the following weeks, the strange circumstances surrounding Toby's behavior continued to escalate, and the Carter family was left even more disturbed. What began as benign eccentricities, such as gazing at empty points in space or growling at the basement door, soon morphed into something more ominous. One night, the family was having dinner when they heard Toby's frantic barking in the living room. Mark sighed and got up to go see what was wrong, his patience coming to an end. "He's probably just looking out at something," he said under his breath. But Pablo froze when he reached the living room. Toby was running between the couch and the window, his eyes wide and fur bristling, barking more urgently with every second. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked, kneeling down. Toby stopped staring at the corner of the room, at nothing at all. Ethan and Lily came up behind him, with a look of confusion and fear on their faces. "Dad, what's wrong with him?" Ethan said, his voice shaking a bit. "I don't know," Mark said, frowning, "but it's getting a little weird." The dog's behavior had begun to escalate. On some days, Toby started to turn down food, a striking change from the interest he used to show in what he ate. However, on nights when the family attempted to gather in front of the television, Toby would curl himself in a corner, watching the door leading to the basement. Whenever a person approached it, he would bark a lot and growl, as though warning that person to get away. Sarah attempted to assuage her ever-increasing fears by assuring herself it was just a phase, the consequence of previous experiences Toby had endured in a world that likely had not been kind to him. But then, one night, everything changed. It was late, past midnight, when the house went strangely quiet. Sarah had just put down her book and was about to fall asleep in bed when she heard it. Faint scratching sounds from the direction of the basement door. Toby had been sleeping next to her, but he was up now, his eyes on the sound. "Mark," she said urgently, her voice trembling. "Listen!" Mark's eyes flew open, and he sat up. The scratching noises grew louder, as though something or someone was about to get inside. Toby growled quietly, his frame tense. "Is it in the basement?" "Mark," he said, already sitting up in bed. Sarah just nodded, her heart thumping in her chest. This was not going to be about a dog in distress. This was something much more unsettling. Mark eased toward the basement door, Toby trailing close behind, his growl deepening with each footfall. Sarah stood in the hallway, her hands shaking as she tracked her husband's every move. The scratching sound had ceased for a time, but now the silence was even more unsettling. "Stay here," Mark told Sarah in a tense whisper. He reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open and there was only dark. Toby growled and shivered, blood and shadow. He turned and glanced at Sarah, then back at the basement door, as though silently begging them not to venture any deeper. But Mark, insistent on tracking the source of the chaos, pressed on, sweeping his flashlight into the darkness. The basement felt empty, quiet, too quiet even. But as Mark descended a few more steps on the stairs, a faint sound emerged into his ears. It wasn't the scratching, but a gentle whisper, faint, rising from the depths of the basement. It was a voice, faint but clear. "Mark!" There went that distant cry playing through the dark. It wasn't Sarah. It was not anyone he knew. Stunned, all of a sudden Mark's heart began to race. Even as a whisper, it grew louder, more frenetic, catching in his chest. "Mark, you're not alone." Suddenly, Toby ran down the stairs in a frenzy, barking as if he was trying to protect Mark from whatever it was down there. But the voice appeared to be pulling him in. The dog's frantic wails overtook the space, overpowering the whisper that still reached for his name. Mark recoiled, his head buzzing. The frantic barking of Toby only added to the feeling that something was very wrong. Sarah rushed to him as he slammed the basement door shut. "What's down there?" she asked, her voice shaking. But Mark had no answer. Now the question wasn't about the basement anymore. It was about what Toby had been trying to tell them all along. There Mark stood, the heavy stillness of the basement door soaking through the room's air. Toby, who had been so calm and cool, was now on hyper-alert, panting loudly as if something dangerous waited just under the floorboards of the house. Sarah put a hand on Mark's arm, feeling the tension in his body. "What's going on, Mark?" she asked, her voice low and barely audible. Mark paused again, his gaze locked on the door as if expecting it to fly open at any second. "I don't know. But something's wrong, Sarah. I'm beginning to have to suspect that it's not just Toby, that there is something down there. Sarah's heart raced. She glanced at Toby, who remained fixed on the basement door, his body coiled like a spring. It might just be his history, the trauma of the shelter. He's just nervous. But underneath, both Sarah and Mark understood that this was more than just Toby's past. There was something more evil going on, something neither of them could formulate. The next morning, Mark was hell-bent on getting to the bottom of it. He called in a professional, a man named Derek, a dog behavior specialist with a few troubled animals under his belt. That afternoon, Derek had come, a tall, rugged man with sharp eyes that appeared to miss nothing. "Mark, Sarah," Derek greeted them when he entered, looking around the room with a cautious eye. "I've heard a bit about Toby. You have yourself a good dog, but there is something here, something bigger than bad habits or fear." It was clear the tension between Sarah and Mark was running high. Sarah wished she could believe Derek would help, but Mark felt his discomfort building. Was it only Toby's behavior that was causing problems, or was it something else he had been too terrified to confess to himself? Derek pulled out a notebook and took the time to write what he was seeing and watching. Toby remained by the door, watching Derek. Derek came to him, his eyes narrowed. It was obvious Toby wasn't crazy about him, but it was more than that. Toby appeared to have gone on red alert, every muscle in his body tight. "The basement's got a problem," Mark admitted, his voice showing his increasing disquiet. "Last night I heard a voice. It called my name. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear I heard it." Derek raised his head from his notes, his face inscrutable. "The voice is interesting. There could be something with the energy in the house. You said Toby's acting all weird, around the basement in particular." Sarah nodded. "Yes, he growls at it. He won't get anywhere near it, and when we do, he acts as if we're being warned. What are you suggesting?" Derek's attention shifted to Toby, who stood frozen in place, still staring intently at the basement door. Derek paused, clearly deep in thought. "I've witnessed animals react to certain presences, things that humans aren't able to feel. If there is a history in this house, a traumatic one, maybe that would account for Toby's behavior." Mark and Sarah looked at each other. What Derek had said was staggering in its implications. Is there something supernatural at play? And if it did, how far did it reach all the way up? Derek bent-exed, making his voice faint. "But there's more. Sometimes it isn't even the house, it's the people who lived in it before. What they leave behind, sometimes, can last well beyond them." Derek's words froze in the air, and for an instant, time itself stood still. So many cars. Growing claustrophobic in the house, he had always been a gentleman of logic, but this was starting to test the limits of his comprehension. Was there really something to Toby's strange behavior, or was that all in his head? "Are you insinuating that someone is still here?" Mark asked, his voice a low whisper. Derek didn't reply right away. He stepped away, eyes darting in the room with a renewed sense of urgency. "I've seen cases like this," he said slowly, "where animals respond to more than the physical environment, and sometimes they feel something lingering, energy, memories, whatever you want to name it, and in rare instances, that presence can impact behavior." Mark looked to Sarah, uncertainty in his eyes. She was equally rattled, but attempting to maintain at least some sense of control. "But Derek, didn't you say that this has happened before? To animals? To other families?" Derek nodded grimly. "Yes. I'm not saying this house is haunted for sure, but maybe there's something here Toby's tuning into. Something that's hit him deeper than we realize." A strange and unsettling stillness descended on the room. Toby, who was pacing around the living room, ceased all action. His head snapped toward the basement door and the muscles in his body went rigid once more, as if he could hear something or someone down there calling him. Mark swallowed hard. He could no longer ignore the sense of dread rising in his chest. "I think we should do a deeper dive into the history of this house," he said, speaking with the authority of someone who experienced fear. "We have to learn who was here before us, what happened here." That night, following Derek's departure, Sarah and Mark remained in the living room with their eyes on the basement door. Toby lay at their feet, his head down and his eyes still cautious. That strange feeling in the houses grew stronger by the day. How little they'd actually known, though, about the place they had called home. The following day, Mark took a trip to his local library. He dug into old records, looking for a shred of evidence that would explain the dark energy clinging to the home. Hours crept by, and with each file he skimmed, his gut clenched tighter. At last, a dusty old ledger attracted his gaze. It was a list of the previous owners of the house. Nothing particularly remarkable at first glance, but when he scanned through the entries, one name grabbed his attention. It belonged to a man named Edward Hargrave, who had lived in the house for almost 20 years. But the circumstances of his death were murky and troubling. Edward Hargrave, Mark muttered to himself, his heart pounding. The more he read, the more apparent it became that something tragic had befallen this man. The last entry described a terrible accident, Edward's sudden, mysterious death, and a string of odd occurrences in the neighborhood. The locals said the house was cursed. A nausea washed over Mark. He knew the pieces of the puzzle were coming together. There was something from the past that Toby had felt, something to do with Edward Hargrave. He ran home, the ledger clutched in hand. He stepped through the front door to find Sarah on the couch with Toby curled beside her. "I found out something," Mark said, his voice tense. Sarah's eyes grew large and she waved him to sit. "What did you find?" Mark inhaled and pointed her to the ledger. "Edward Hargrave, the former owner of the house. He died suddenly and then odd things began to occur. It's as if the house was, haunted." At the name, Toby lifted his head, his ears perking up. He turned to Mark, then to Sarah, and then back to the door leading to the basement. It was as though the dog recognized the seriousness of what had been discovered. "I think we need to go down there," Mark's steely voice came through. "It's the only way we are going to get to the bottom of this." That night, the atmosphere in the house weighed heavier than ever. The temperature had lowered, and an uncanny hush had descended. Toby, so alert in general, now seemed near silent, as if his high energy had been overweighed by whatever had haunted the house. Sarah could feel it too. There was a palpable tension still hanging over them, choking the warmth out of their home. I did that with the trembling hands around the old ledger. It thrilled through him, the name Edward Hargrave, a name he had seemed to forget until it came to him, as though it had released something wicked in the house, something that had been kept beyond the door. He knew with absolute certainty that what they were about to face would turn their entire world upside down. But they had no choice now. This mystery was too big, too significant to overlook. They needed answers. "I have a hunch Toby knows something," Sarah said, her voice low. She glanced down at the dog, whose gaze remained on the basement door. "It's as if he's been waiting for us to realize that." Mark nodded, his face dour. "I believe he's more than a dog, Sarah. He is the one who unlocks everything." They stood up together, the burden of the decision weighing heavily on their shoulders. He approached the basement door, finger grazing the old brass handle. Toby growled low in his throat, as though telling him to back off. But Mark didn't hesitate. The door creaked as it opened, a cold breeze suddenly rushing towards them, bringing with it the wafting scent of dampness and decay. The basement stretched on endlessly into darkness, engulfing all within its reach. The stairs down had a menacing quality, as if they'd been waiting for someone to finally come down into their depths. Toby's growled, body vibrating, pressed up against Sarah. Maybe he felt what was to come. It was that moment that Mark turned to Sarah. "Are you ready?" Sarah didn't speak, she just nodded, her look determined. They had come this far. The die was cast, and there was no returning to past normalcy. Taking a deep breath, Mark took the lead down the stairs, the sound of his footsteps reverberating in the silence. Toby trailing closely behind, never taking his eyes off the darkness below. When they arrived at the bottom, Mark flipped the light switch. A dim bulb flickered overhead and cast long shadows on the walls. The basement was much bigger than they had thought. The room was full of dust and cobwebs and piles of old furniture and things that were most likely forgotten. But it wasn't the clutter that didn't catch their attention. It was something else. At the far account of the room, behind an old stack of boxes, something gleamed in the dim light. It was a small, tarnished metal box midway buried under the rubble. Toby froze, his body stiffened, his eyes fixed on the box as if he'd seen it before. Mark stepped closer, the feeling of foreboding sinking deeper with each step. As she started to make her way toward the direction of the box, his heartbeat raced in his chest. When his fingers touched the cold metal, the temperature of the room dropped instantly. The flickering lights created sinister shadows that moved over the walls. With a bang, the basement door slammed shut behind them, slugging them inside. Toby barked frantically, and Mark's heart leapt as he turned to Sarah. "It's too late," Mark said in a whisper. "We've triggered something. Whatever it is, it's here." Sarah glanced up in terror, but she stood firm with Mark. "We need to open that box. We need to know what is inside." Mark nodded. The air around them thickened with an unspoken tension, as if the very hairs on the back of their necks stood up, sensing the house was holding its breath. Mark grasped the box in trembling hands, and something almost palpable filled the air as he raised it up. It got even colder, and the quiet was almost stifling. There was no turning back. With trembling fingers, Mark began to pry open the metal box. There was a great stillness in the basement, and even Toby seemed to realize that something momentous was to come. His eyes were fixed, his muscles tense, his furriness aflame. As soon as the box creaked open, a blast of cold hit the room, sending a shiver down Mark's spine. The box contained a bundle of old, yellowing papers held together with a tattered piece of twine. Mark swallowed, his heart pounding, and slowly undid the bundle. As the papers began to unfold, a dark history started to unfold before him. The initial document was an obituary, the name Edward Hargrave. It had confirmed what Mark had already suspected, that the man had died tragically, though it was disturbingly vague on the details. Details of how he died were sparse, except that it had been sudden and unexplained. But it wasn't only the obituary that left a cold chill running through Mark. A few more disturbing details emerged as he read on. The papers were packed, though, with a succession of stranger and stranger, more and more disturbing stories. The disappearance of those near to the man, weird noises coming from inside the home late at night, whispers of a rite performed in the basement. A wave of nausea rose in Mark's throat. The blues were starting to connect, and with them, a deep, disturbing truth. The house and Edward Hargrave himself were connected to something far darker than he could ever have dreamed. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice almost too low to hear. She had stood silently next to Mark, her eyes on the papers. "I felt it when we moved in. Something was not right here. I just didn't know how terrible it was." Mark stared at her palely with the revelation. "This house, it's been cursed, Sarah. Edward Hargrave was doing what he should not have been doing. Something that has left its mark here in the house, here on us. Toby, he's tried to warn us the whole time." Sarah's eyes were wide with horror, but there was also a deep understanding. She realized that they were now enmeshed in a conflict far larger than she could have ever imagined. The house wasn't merely haunted, it was caught up in something darker. After Mark had rummaged through many documents, there was a document that he couldn't ignore. It was a letter, scrawled in a shaky hand. The letter was directed to a Clara, without identifying her. The letter's contents were chilling. The ritual was finished, but something went awry. I fear the consequences. The house is changing. Not only the walls are changing, and something more sinister is stirring within. Clara, if you see this, you have to put a stop to this. You have to stop it before it's too late. Mark's throat constricted as he reread the words. A ritual, a dark power that had been unleashed, and now it appeared to be waking up again. Toby, who had been laying quietly watching, barked loudly, then let out a low, menacing growl. His body was rigid, his eyes locked onto something in the corner of the room. His heart leaped as he turned to see. The shadows in the basement appeared to dart about in ways that defied logic. The temperature dropped lower, and the sound of whispering called further away. There was a cold, unnatural presence looming, poised to override them. "What is it, Toby?" Mark whispered, his voice thick with fear. Toby's growls intensified, his hackles up, but he didn't budge. The dog seemed to be standing watchdog, guarding against whatever was lurking just off stage. That is when Mark realized the ritual, the curse, whatever evil had been unleashed. It was connected to Edward Hargrave's death, and it was now after them. It was as if the basement air had thickened and the shadows were elongated by the passage of seconds. Mark was registering that there was something in the room now, something dark, something malevolent. It was not only the air that was changing, the house itself was alive, vibrating with a nauseating energy. Toby's growls grew louder, more urgent, as he raced to the corner of the room where the shadows appeared to swirl and shift. He could see them now, figures, faint but unmistakable, flickering in and out of sight. The very walls seemed to breathe, to be a living, breathing organism that was coming alive after a long hibernation. "Mark, we have to get out of here." Sarah's voice trembled with a subdued urgency. She reached for his arm, but Mark refused to stir. He looked towards the corner, where the shadows were beginning to take form. "Our flight leaves." "We can't leave," Mark said, both soft-spoken and firm. "We have to stop this now. Whatever Edward let loose, it's still here, Sarah. It's in the home and it's coming for us. We have to figure out how to stop this curse, how to end this." "Well," Sarah said, her features conflicted. She felt the weight of his words, the fear that held both of them. But she also knew that she could not remain in the basement any longer. They would have to confront what was coming, or risk being swallowed whole by it. Toby barked, bringing Mark back to reality. The dog stared into the shadows, his body tensely fixed, every muscle coiled up for a spring. Mark followed the dog's gaze, and what he saw sent chills through his body. Out of the dark came a figure, a tall and bony form that appeared out of the shadows themselves. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural aspect, sparkling with an eerie light, while the thing moved with a strange fluidity that was both terrifying and unnatural. Mark's heart raced. "It's him," he whispered, "Edward Hargrave. He's come back." The figure didn't speak. It simply stared, its gaze fixed on Mark with an uncanny ferocity. The noise in the air became louder, the sound as if 1,000 voices were coming together in the room, speaking in tongue. The atmosphere in the room had become stifling, and he could sense his sight growing increasingly foggy, the air itself being sucked out of him. Toby barked as if he were possessed, growls ringing off the basement walls. But the figure did not budge. It got nearer, every step so slow and so steady, so deliberate, as if it were enjoying the terror in the air. Sarah clung to Mark's arm and spoke almost inaudibly. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" Mark's mind raced. It was like the answer was there, but barely out of reach, a gentle breeze upon my eardrums. Then by instinct, he grabbed the papers he had in his hand, the letter from Edward Hargrave. He had missed something earlier, something important. "Wait," Mark said, his eyes traveling over the letter again. "It's not only the house that's cursed, the ritual. It was not a means to bring him back. It was meant to bind him, to trap him here." And Sarah realized the bond she was forming with the boy. "We have to undo the ritual. We must wield the same power that tethered him here to cast him out for eternity." Wolf one more, and Toby again braced his body. He turned to look at the figure. The walls of the house buckled and groaned in protest. It felt as if the earth quaked beneath them. The figure suddenly charged, its eyes aflame with rage, and Mark stepped in front of Sarah instinctively, protectively, as the shadows reached out for them. The atmosphere crackled with energy, and for a brief period everything went dark. And then, in the dark, Mark heard a voice. A voice so cold, so filled with rage, it froze him into place. "You cannot escape me. This house is mine." The voice in the dark, cold, unyielding, caressed itself through Mark's mind. This hit him like the moment when you realize you've been hit over the head until your whole being is frozen. The shadows encroached on him from all angles, suffocating him, blocking out any chance of light. His heart pounded, every instinct urging him to run, to flee. But there was no escape. The house had become a cage, and the figure before him was the encager. But Mark's gaze landed on Toby, standing protectively between him and Sarah. The growls of the dog were low and booming, as if he too sensed the heavy weight of the darkness closing in. Toby was not backing down, despite the way the shadows seemed to reach out toward him. "No," Mark whispered, as if that was all that held him together. "We're not giving up." He remembered the letter, the ritual, the way that the power had been used to ensnare Edward Hargrave here. If they were going to survive, they had to harness that same power. But they needed to reverse it this time. He fumbled through the papers held in his hands as his arms shook. Sarah stood right next to him, her face white with fear, but resolute. She took his arm, a firm grip. "Mark, we need to hurry," she said through gritted teeth. "He's getting closer." Mark nodded, his heart racing in his chest. The figure had started to move, slow and deliberate, as though relishing the fear it was generating. Mark's gaze flicked between the letter and the figure. "There's a pattern," he said under his breath. "The ritual. It's based on words. We must speak the words that hold him accountable. We must undo what he got done." Toby's ears swiveled, his eyes intent on Mark, wide. For a brief second, Mark thought he saw something like human understanding in the dog's eyes, a private understanding, a shared consciousness. "Hang on, buddy," Mark said quietly to Toby. "We're not letting him win." Mark inhaled deeply and moved forward, waves of shadows moving toward him, ready to wash over him. Edward Hargrave loomed in the air all about him, choking everything. The freezing, stale air coursed through his lungs, but he held on. He couldn't stop. With shaking hands, Mark started to recite the words from the letter. Softly at first, then louder, as if trying to force the power to go, trying to force the spell to break. "I bind you to this place, Edward Hargrave. I command the powers that have bound you to reverse your actions. We are no longer here to welcome you. Be gone from this house. Go back to the shadows you came from." The figure hissed, glowing eyes narrowing with rage. The air vibrated with energy, the temperature dropping to even further frigid levels. The wings of the creature filled with shadows as it tried to pull Mark back into the darkness. But Mark didn't stop. He said the words again, this time louder, and his voice echoed with all the fear, all the pain, all the uncertainty they had felt. "You are but a shadow of your former self. Your time here is over. I command you to leave." Just as Mark finished reciting the last word, the house groaned. Its walls shook violently. The darkness started to shrink away from him, separating like the tide rushing back from the shore. The temperature started to heat up, the shivering cold abating. Edward Hargrave's shape began to flicker and tremble, sputtering like a dying ember, and for a fleeting moment Mark thought he saw something else in his eyes, something like recognition, as if the figure understood that his time had been reached. Then, with one final horrible cry, the figure fell into the shadow, disappearing just as quickly as it had arrived. For a flash, there was silence. Mark stood panting, his body shaking from the effort. It was as if the house was exhaling, and the grip it had over them was beginning to loosen. The air was cleaner now, less suffocating. It was Sarah's voice that interrupted the quiet. We did it." Mark turned back, his heart still beating, but this time feeling relief wash over him. Toby, who had been keeping watch the entire time, wagged his tail, the tension in his body releasing at last. "We did it," Mark said again, a smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "It's over." Even as those words slipped from Mark's lips, though, he was aware of a change inside the house. It was done, yes, but not without a price. Darkness seeped from the basement into the morning light. The air of the place that had once been thick with a malevolent presence now felt lighter, purged in a sense. In the middle of the room, Mark stood, breathing, to feel the sense of calm wash over him. Toby padded over to his side and nudged his leg gently. Mark smiled at the dog, running his fingers through the fur, thankful for the loyal friend that had kept them safe. Sarah stood behind him, watching the house breathe a sigh of relief. The thing that had pressed down on them for so long, like a Dominican father who wouldn't leave home alive, was gone, and only silence remained. "It's over," Sarah said, her voice quaking with a relief she could hardly grasp. She walked over to Mark and took his hand in hers. "It's really over." Mark gazed at her with eyes that blended weariness and victory. The worst, he told himself, was behind them, but a part of him could never shake the memories of what they had gone through. "I never thought something like that would happen. We thought we were simply adding a dog to our mix. We never imagined it would come to this." The disbelief in Sarah's voice was underlined by a dry chuckle. "I don't think anybody would have anticipated this, Mark." Toby huffed, wagging his tail like the mood lightener he was, and they both chuckled. It was a brief touch of normalcy, but it felt meaningful, like a breakthrough in a story that had felt as though it was spiraling out of control. If Lost Generation is the workforce in this basement, then Mark is the boss. And the walls no longer seemed to breathe with the same oppressive shadows. Yet, while the house itself felt lighter, Mark knew it wasn't only the physical space that was different. They too had transformed. Together they had endured hell, fear and despair and the unknown. But they had come through it, stronger. Their bond had deepened. They had been pushed to their limits and had learned what they were capable of in the darkness. "This house," Mark said, his voice low but resolute, "is never going to be the same. But neither will we. We'll make it ours, Sarah. We'll rebuild. We'll turn it into a beacon of peace." Sarah nodded, squeezing his hand in agreement. Together. The ever-silent yet steady in their lives, Toby nudged Mark's side once more, as if to say, "We got this." And at that moment, they both realized the journey moving forward would not be the same. The threat was gone, and now it was time to reconstruct their lives, to make a home filled with love and light, not fear and darkness. But they could never forget what they had faced, or the strength they had discovered in one another. As they climbed the stairs and opened the doors to sunlight pouring through the windows, they felt the ballast of the past begin to slip away. Once a prison, the house now felt like a space for new beginnings. Mark gazed at Sarah, his lips curving into a smile. Let's make this our home. For real this time. And so the three of them, Mark and Sarah and Toby, stepped into the next chapter of their lives, leaving behind the shadows of the past and walking into a future full of hope.